You know, these past few weeks have been some of the busiest and most amazing weeks in ministry that I've seen. Shared earlier with the government shutdown, and when we learned that the SNAP benefits for many of our neighbors were going to lapse in November. I spent hours on the phone and Zoom meetings and working with others, and our whole community jumped into action in a powerful way. And especially Kern Church showed up as we shared that we were able to serve 15,000 pounds of food, serve over 400 families in the midst of that, and just so grateful for all of that. This month, we have hosted 3 food pantry distributions, including the 2 after-hours distributions, and the most recent one was this past Thursday, and volunteers came from all over town to help make that possible. Donations came in from all over the place. Neighbors helped neighbors. People reach out to me. Food showed up in places we didn't even think food could show up in, and people were fed, and God was at work. And moments like this remind me of why I believe in the church. Moments like this remind me of why I believe in the church. Because when there is a gap, God calls us to step in. When there's a lapse, God calls us to step forward. God calls the church to make a difference, and you did, and we did, and it has been an amazing response. I continue to be overwhelmed by this response and what has been possible. Miracles have been at work, and you have been a part of them. You have truly been a part of them. And I couldn't be more proud and more honored to be your pastor. Now I want to tell you something that may or may not come as a surprise to you, but as hard as I've been working over these past few weeks to try to figure out what to do and how to manage this, it was pretty easy to find volunteers and money. Like, it was actually really easy. Mike would look at me, and I didn't even ask for money, and about $10,000 showed up from our community, from our church, and from outside partners like the United Way and other churches. It was pretty easy to find volunteers as we sent out emails, as we let people know what was happening here. People in our community knew that there was a crisis, and they wanted to make a difference. And I believe that most people want to make a difference in life, and that's one of our core commitments and core beliefs here at Kern, is that we want to help people make a difference and help other people make a difference. And this proved to be true in response to this food emergency. And really, when there is a clear crisis, when people are hungry, or when there's an obvious need like a natural disaster, it's really pretty easy to find help. It's really pretty easy to find volunteers. It's really pretty easy to find money, at least at the beginning, the resources to make a difference, because it's exciting work, it feels good, and you can see a tangible impact, a tangible difference made right in front of your face. It makes an obvious and immediate impact. But over these past few weeks, I've also been faced with a different reality, kind of a sobering reality as well. Because you know what makes this possible? What makes this possible? What makes this type of response possible? What makes this miraculous response possible? What makes this emergency response possible? What makes this possible? It's the boring stuff. The boring stuff. Without the boring stuff, none of this other stuff would happen. Without the boring stuff, behind the scenes stuff, none of the responses that you have seen been a part of over the past few weeks would have happened. Without the boring stuff, none of the quick response, the crisis coordination, the make an immediate difference stuff ever happens. Without the boring stuff, the amazing food pantry response that we've seen here would not be possible. And here's what I mean. Without paying an electric bill, the lights wouldn't be on. Without paying the gas bill, the heat wouldn't work. Without paying staff, there wouldn't be a leader who was connected in the community and going to community meetings and listening to different opportunities to make a difference. Without paying staff who could answer the phone, unlock doors, manage logistics, make calls, food wouldn't arrive. Without paying for insurance and maintenance and working restrooms, volunteers couldn't serve. And there's nothing more boring than things like insurance. And I'm sorry if anybody's works in that field, but there's nothing more boring than insurance and maintenance and working restrooms. And it's easy, so easy to raise money for big, visible projects like a food response. It's easy. I mean, we do it without even asking. In fact, I asked this church not to give to this, and you did anyways. But without a regular budget, none of this would be possible. None of this would have been possible. For many people, it feels boring to give to things like budgets. It feels boring to give to things like budgets. Many people inside and outside the church, and this is true across organizations, many people inside and outside the church assume that someone will give to a budget. Someone will, maybe not me, because I want to make sure that the money that I give it makes a difference in a different way. But somebody surely will give to a budget. And many people think that they want to use their funds to do something that seems to make a bigger impact than a budget. But it may feel boring to give to budgets. I mean, it may feel boring to give to budgets, but it's the boring giving that makes extraordinary ministry possible. It's the boring giving that makes extraordinary ministry possible. And it's not just us, it's not just here. Across our city, across our community, nearly all the food pantries that we see are run by churches. Nearly all the food pantries that we see are run by churches or run out of churches. And without boring budgets to fund the staff, to fund the electricity, to pay for the insurance, the parking lots, none of these food pantries would be able to operate. It's the boring that makes the extraordinary possible. And food isn't the only thing that's been happening this month, especially here at Kern. We've received several calls from local kids' basketball teams, like the younger ones, those younger kids who are learning to play basketball. We've received several calls to see if they could use our gym to practice. And I want you to know that in town, besides the schools, which these different teams really can't use all that much because the schools use them, you know where nearly all the gyms are? They're in churches. They're in churches. A couple of years ago, my daughter was on the fifth grade basketball team, which was sort of connected to the school, but they weren't really able to practice in the school. And I don't know why. It was scheduling or new gym floor, whatever the case may be. It was sort of a quasi-school team, but they weren't really able to practice in the school, but they were able to practice here. They were looking all over town for a gym, and I was like, well, I kind of know of a place that has a gym, and maybe we could practice there. I can ask, and it happened. They were able to practice here. And I know that in the past, this church has hosted more basketball than it does now, but our gym is still in use by young kids who are learning to play basketball. And it's not just basketball, of course, because when you're involved with sports, there's character development, there's life skills that you're learning, and that goes along with that as well. You won't find a basketball gym at a mall or at an office building, but you will find them in churches. You will find them in churches. And if the statistics are correct, for about 60% of our basketball families or our food pantry families, that's the only time when they're at church for basketball or for food, that's the only time that they'll be in church during a given week. When they're playing basketball, when they're getting food. But yet their lives are touched in a powerful way by your ministry, by the ministry of this church. You know, times have changed, and in many ways, churches are still the heartbeat of our communities, even if our communities don't always know it. During our food crisis, I observed how that was critically true. Now, while it is true, it's also true that many churches these days find themselves in a difficult position. They're struggling. The past few decades in America, we've seen decline in church attendance around the nation and participation. We've seen a decline in people, a decline in finances. And at Kern, we're not immune to this. We're also part of a denomination called the United Methodist Church. And each year, leaders from our churches gather together for what we call annual conference. And during these annual conference meetings that happen every year in June, one of the actions that the conference always does is vote on church closures. And during the 20 years that I've been attending this conference, we have voted to close a great number of churches Churches that were started with dreams and aspirations. Churches that were started to change the world, to help people grow in faith, to bring hope in mining communities, to bring restoration in rural communities, to help our cities grow in the love and grace of Jesus Christ. We have voted to close a great number of churches that were no longer viable, or people were no longer even meeting there. On top of this, I've seen year after year how the budget at the annual conference has been cut back to deal with things like declining finances. And Kern even has its own experience with some of this. But I want you to know that this is not limited to one church, one denomination, one community. These are trends that we see around us. And the sobering reality that came alive to me during this past month, as we've seen our community relying so heavily on churches. I mean, people were going to churches to say, like, somebody's got to do this, somebody's got to help us. That if our churches were to disappear, none of this would have happened. Or at least it would have happened in a diminished way. This past month, our government failed people. Period, full stop. But churches responded. And if the churches weren't here, what would have happened? What would have happened? Who would have provided volunteers? Who would have purchased the food? It doesn't come free. Who would have made sure that people don't go hungry? If it weren't for churches, who? If a church disappears, it's not just a building that's lost, it's a community impact that's lost, it's food that's lost, it's gym space that's lost, it's a safe place for kids to grow that's lost, it's hope that's lost. And this is one of the reasons I believe so strongly in the church. And I have to tell you, the church has changed my life. Jesus has changed my life. If it wasn't for Jesus, if it wasn't for the church, I would be a completely different person. If it wasn't for the church, I would be a complete a-hole. I mean, I'm kind of a partial a-hole these days, but if it wasn't for the church, it would be complete, full stop, all the time. I mean, without the church, without Jesus who changed and is changing my life, I'd be lost. It was kind of selfish, right, in my own life, like wanting the church. And the church has been so much a part of this. Even today, I think about my small group, our Belong group. It's changed me. The support, the relationships, the proximity to other followers of Jesus has changed and is changing me. Worship every week shapes me and changes me. And none of this is flashy. Sometimes it's boring. But you know what? It's also holy. It's also good. It's also life-changing. And because I attend to this week in and week out, I get the great privilege to see some pretty extraordinary things happen. Because it's the boring that makes the extraordinary possible. And it's not just me either. The early Christian leader, a guy by the name of Paul, taught a similar message. And one time he was writing to some Christians who were living in the town of Corinth, and he was trying to communicate and encourage them in their giving. And he tells us this in his second letter that he wrote to the Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 6, he wrote this. He said, "This is what I mean. The one who sows a small number of seeds will also reap a small crop. The one who sows a generous amount of seeds will also reap a generous crop. Everyone should give whatever they have decided in their heart. They shouldn't give with hesitation or because of pressure. God loves a cheerful giver. God has the power to provide you with more than enough of every kind of grace. That way, you will have everything you need, always and in everything, to provide more than enough for every kind of good work. As it is written, He scattered everywhere. He gave to the needy. His righteousness remains forever. The one who supplies seed for planting and bread for eating will supply and multiply your seed and increase your crop, which is righteousness. You will be made rich in every way so that you can be generous in every way. Such generosity produces thanksgiving to God through us." And what really strikes me about what Paul is saying here is that he compares generosity and giving to the ministry of the church. So he compares giving and generosity to the ministry of God in the church with sowing seeds and harvesting crops, with sowing seeds and harvesting crops. Now, there is very little that is better than harvesting a good crop. I'm already missing the fresh summer vegetables that would come from my neighbor's garden and some from my little garden. I'm already missing them. The fresh tomatoes, the fresh summer squash, the fresh peppers, they are so good. They're so good. It was so much fun picking tomatoes off the vine and seeing another one grow, and then gathering my peppers and knowing that once I plucked them, another round would grow mysteriously and magically. I don't know how it happened, but it happened, and I had peppers. But you know what wasn't fun, at least for me? What wasn't fun was watering the plants. It was not fun. Taking care of the plants was not fun. I didn't even do it from seeds. Someone else cared for the seeds and gave us the plants, and we bought a couple of plants, and then we put them in our own containers. But it was boring taking care of these things. And we did pretty good at the beginning of the summer, but then like July was here, and it got so boring we even neglected them quite a bit and quit watering them. It was fun at the beginning, but then it got hot and humid, and we got busy, and it wasn't fun. And I guess this is one of the many reasons that I'm not a farmer. Like this is like it's not in the cards for me. Planting seeds and caring for emerging plants, it's not glamorous work. It's not glamorous work. We used to live in a community that was surrounded by farms. There was probably more cows than there were people in the community. There were cattle farms and dairy farms and farms with crops, and there was nothing glamorous about the work. It was dirty. It was slow. It was repetitive. But if you don't sow the seed, and you don't care for the crop, you're never going to get a harvest. You're never going to get the joy and the excitement of the harvest if you don't sow the seed and if you don't care for the crop. Without sowing, there is no harvest. Without the boring, non-glamorous work of planting and caring, there's no celebration at the harvest. Without the boring work of sowing and tending plants, there can be no fresh sliced tomatoes with salt. There can be no fresh squash and zucchini on the grill. There can be no fresh peppers to liven up your taste buds. There can be no fresh basil to put in your summer salad. And there can be no fresh mint to put in your mint julep if that's your thing. Like it's only possible because you do the hard work, the boring work. And the same is true with generosity. It may feel boring to give to budgets. I get it. But it's the boring giving that makes the extraordinary possible. And just like sowing seeds, giving isn't about instant results. It's about trust. It's about trusting that something will happen, that God will use what you give to bless others and multiply the impact. And that's what Paul goes on to say in what he's writing. He says that when you are faithful in sowing, when you are faithful in the boring, that even the boring giving stuff, that your generosity will overflow and be multiplied. And it will also cause people to begin to see God. Here's what he says in verse 10. I've already read it, but read it again. The one who supplies seed for planting and bread for eating will supply and multiply your seed and increase your crop, which is righteousness. When you give the boring gift, when I give the boring gift, it makes an impact. And when we join these boring gifts with other people who are giving perhaps boring gifts, God multiplies and increases the impact. This is why even though it may feel boring to give to things like budgets, it's the boring giving that makes extraordinary ministry possible. And then Paul goes on to say this in verse 11. He says, you will be made rich in every way, so that you can be generous in every way. Such generosity produces thanksgiving to God through us. Not only is it about an increase in funds, it's about an increase in impact. Boring giving makes extraordinary ministry possible. And when this outpouring happens, God says it produces thanksgiving to God. That your generosity helps people recognize and give thanks to God. Every box of food, Every open gym, every family that has quality childcare at Kern Church through Camp Faith Nursery School, every child who is reached, every person who is given hope, everyone who has a small group to care for them, to help support them, is an opportunity for people to recognize God and to give thanks. And all of that is possible because somebody made a boring gift. Because it's a boring giving that makes the extraordinary ministry possible. So here's what I want to invite you to do this week. Inside your worship program, if you've got one, there's a Grateful Life giving commitment card. I want you to fill this out, especially today. I want you to take it home. I want you to pray about it. And this isn't about pressure or guilt. In fact, in the same passage, Paul also says everyone should give whatever they have decided in their heart. Everyone should give whatever they have decided in their heart without pressure, without hesitation, because God loves a cheerful giver. This is just about deciding how boring you are. I mean, that's a really bad joke, so thanks for not laughing too hard. But it's about deciding how boring you are. And I want to invite you to prayerfully decide how you're going to sow seeds into the kind of ministry that changes lives. And I know that giving to budgets can be boring, but boring giving is what makes extraordinary ministry possible. And I want to invite you to start somewhere. And one of the best and most boring ways to do this is to give systematically and proportionally. And if you've never done this before, that's completely okay. And maybe you're not doing it now, or maybe you've done it before, you're not doing it now. That's completely okay. Well, but I want to invite you, if you're a part of this church, if you call this your church home, I want to invite you to start somewhere. Just start somewhere, to prayerfully ask God where to start. And maybe that means beginning by making a commitment to set aside maybe 1% of your income as a start, just to set aside for God, to give it to the ministry of God at the church. And last week, if you were with us, we talked about this a little bit. We talked about how God asks us to give at least 10%, to give at least a tithe back to God. But I think that if you aren't used to giving, thinking about giving 10% can be scary, especially scary to start with. So start somewhere, write it down, take a step, and turn the card back in the coming weeks. Don't bring it today, but turn it back in the coming weeks. Next week or sometime before the end of the year, maybe we even make a date, like by December 14th. Sometimes we need deadlines. So bring it in by December 14th. I'm just making that up. But just as a discipline to say, yeah, how boring can I be? And if you already give, and you're thinking about giving systematically and proportionally, maybe you consider increasing your giving by 1% next year. Or maybe you're ready to step up to a tithe or step beyond a tithe. Whatever God is inviting you, do it without guilt, without pressure. Wherever you are, just take a step. And as amazing as it is to be able to respond in the big needs in our community, like we've done over the past few weeks, most generosity, it isn't all that exciting, and it doesn't have to be all that emotional or about these flashy things, because most generosity is actually pretty boring. It's actually about trust. It's about believing that small and steady and faithful and even boring giving is what God can use to do extraordinary things. And I want to encourage you to complete this giving card, bring it back in the next couple weeks, and I want to tell you why I think this is important. It could be like, I don't need to fill this out. I don't need anybody to know, and that's true. You don't have to fill this out. But I'm going to fill one out, and I'll tell you why I think it's important, and it's really a practical and a boring reason of why I think it's important. But I believe that the decision, that if you're going to make a decision here, that it's a decision that comes from God, and it's something that God is going to honor. But at least for me, when I make a decision with God, I want to live up to my end of that. And last year, my family, we decided that we were going to increase our giving for the coming year, which is this year. As we prayed about it, wrote it down, and turned it in about this time last year. Well, January came, and I completely forgotten. I completely forgotten what God told me I was going to give, and I didn't want to pray about it again. I didn't, because I was afraid God might ask me to give more. Like I didn't want to go through the whole thing again. And so when I went to write my check for that month, because I still write checks, I've got checks, and I was like, well, I might as well write them to the church. I don't write them to anywhere else. So I write checks to give to the church. When I write my check, I had no idea what I was supposed to write it for. I forgot, completely forgot. But because I wrote and turned in my giving estimate card, I was able to call our treasurer, Mike. Actually, his office is just down from mine, so I was just able to go pester him and say, hey, how much did I say I was going to give to the church? And he told me, and I was able to write a check for that amount. But that was possible only because of the boring act of completing that card. And I completely forgot. But that was a reminder for me. You know, friends, it is such, that's why I think it's important, by the way, if you didn't connect the dots. But friends, it is such an honor to be your pastor. It really is. I believe that God is using Kern to make a difference right here and right now. And I believe that the best is yet to come for our ministry together, for our lives together. That God is preparing to use this church to make a difference in the lives of our next generation, so that they can then make a difference in the lives of the next generation when all of us are dead and gone. God invites us to just keep sowing, to keep doing the small, faithful, even boring things that can make big miracles possible. And I know it may feel boring to give to things like budgets, but it's the boring giving that makes extraordinary ministry possible. So as you go home this week, take your card, and just pray about it. And if this is not your church home, that's fine. You take it with you anyways and pray about it. And maybe you have a different church that you want to participate in, or a different way to give. But maybe that's a reminder to pray and to ask God how you can sow into the future, how you can sow into the future ministry of this church and the future ministry of God. Because when you give to God's work, you're not just funding a budget. You're really not. You're joining God's story of transformation. So let's keep sowing. Let's keep trusting. Let's keep being a church that shows up in emergencies, that shows up in everyday moments, that shows up in the quiet, steady work of faith, even when things are a little boring. Friends, I want to pray for you right now. God, I give you thanks. I give you thanks for the ways that you show up all over life. You show up in big ways and small ways and exciting ways and boring ways. And God, I pray that your church, that myself, that my family, that all the families here will take seriously this call to pray. Take seriously this call to pray, to ask, what is it, God, that you want us to do? Maybe as it relates to giving, how can I give to support even some boring work that makes exciting things possible? And God, as we prepare to leave this place, I pray that your Spirit comes, your Spirit moves, and you lead us in your ways. In Christ Jesus, our Lord. Amen.